All right, welcome. If you're watching this on YouTube, this is a webinar that I'm hosting on July 2024, the Elixir Security Roadmap. My name is Michael Lubis. I'm the founder of Praxio.io, which is a company that helps developers secure their work. The main product was launched in 2022. All of the customers right now are using Elixir and Phoenix, so relevant for our topic today. And my whole professional background has been in software security. So if you're curious who's using Praxial, several companies, all of these are using Elixir. Elixir Conf, the website when you go there is actually written in Elixir, which I thought was pretty cool. Just a little bit of context on the business. So for today, the title of this session is the Elixir Security Roadmap, and the target audience is CTOs and developers. I think it's useful to have kind of an example company or startup to discuss. So this is Black Hat Projects. Imagine a startup that makes project management software. You can create a project, upload files, share it with your coworkers. People sign up and use their credit card to pay a monthly fee, or they get invoices. I think most people watching this can kind of picture that sort of business. And then executives are concerned, what if we get hacked? Is our product secure? That's a really reasonable concern, I think, in general, but especially in these past few weeks, for people watching this, maybe in the future, there was this very large hack at AT&T recently. They just arrested someone, apparently, according to a release from AT&T. I think Disney is currently dealing with their data breach as well. It's just a very topical thing, and I don't think that's going to really change anytime soon in terms of the risk that businesses face from bad guys. So I want to use examples that are a little bit in the past because with current events, you don't know all the details. The Equifax breach is a really good case study because not only was it high profile and a lot of money was involved, it was also studied in a lot of detail by the US government, by researchers. And these were the main findings. So Equifax is a big credit ratings agency here in the United States. They were using Apache struts for web applications. So you have Ruby, the programming language, and then Ruby on Rails, the web framework, Python and Django, Elixir and Phoenix. It's Java and struts. So what happened with Equifax is they didn't have an asset inventory of all of their struts apps, and a remote code execution exploit was posted on GitHub. That means anybody in the world could go on the GitHub page, download this code, and then break in to a struts server that was running this vulnerable version, getting the equivalent of like production SSH access. So if you've ever heard of this full disclosure debate, when one person finds like a vulnerability in struts, what they often will do is just report it to the team. It'll secretly get fixed, and then the patch will come out. But the thing is, once information about the exploit is public, that means anybody in the world can just break into these web servers. So that's why these exploits are called like 0 days or N days. This is kind of the level of harm that can happen with them. So Struts got hacked, then Equifax got hacked, and it was a huge problem for their business. And this is relevant for Elixir developers and businesses using Elixir. So imagine that your Elixir application, the Black Hat projects in this case, is vulnerable to this type of bug, to remote code execution. And that can happen in the code that your developer is writing, or it could be in a library like Plug or Phoenix or one of your dependencies. That's one major way that these data breaches happen. Another way is a little bit more low tech, because the exploit thing, you have to be very smart to figure out how to, find those types of bugs. The kind of lower tech way is you just write a bot that does, 100,000 login attempts using publicly leaked like credential pairs that show up in data breaches. That's extremely effective. I've personally seen that work to log into people's financial accounts where they had a lot of money stored. It's extremely effective, very low tech. I think most people on this call could write like an HTTP bot with just like a normal client in Elixir or Python or something to do that. Very low tech, but it's extremely effective. So for today. You are the CTO of Black Cat Project Management. You don't have a lot of time and budget because you work in a startup, but how do you prevent a data breach? This is really what it all comes down to. There's all these standards and frameworks, and at the end of the day, it's, are we in the news because we just got hacked? How do you prevent that from happening? And what are your highest priority items? So this problem is really what prompted me to write this guide, because I've worked in cybersecurity for a number of years, and the things that are really important can often be a bit counterintuitive if you haven't just, worked in the industry and been around this sort of thing for a while. And I think the first example, so these are ranked in order of priority. And the number one priority, I think, for every business from a security perspective, it's not like hiring some super elite hacker. It's not, doing some crazy engagement. The number one priority is really just asset management. It is, how many Elixir apps do we have that are currently exposed to the public internet? What versions of Elixir and Phoenix and Plug are they running? If there was a really bad exploit that came out for Phoenix tomorrow that was all over the news, could we reasonably patch that within 24 hours? This is by far the most important thing. Equifax didn't have an asset inventory. If they did, they could have found that server that was vulnerable and patched it or taken it offline, but they didn't know where the server was, and that is that was a root cause of that data breach. So there's different ways you can do this, specific to Elixir. I like the runtime, like the applications, load applications. You can actually get that list at runtime. So like your app starts up, pull the list. Mix.lock is another option. My kind of concern with it is that Mix.lock won't always match exactly what's in production. You could check Mix.lock into GitHub. I think everyone on this call has also dealt with CI/CD pipelines, and that things can get a little hairy there. It's not guaranteed that it's going to match what's in production. So I like runtime, and that's what Praxial.io does. So this is a pretty big feature of Praxial. It actually got shipped after I wrote this guide because I realized how important it was. If you have like 20 or 50 Elixir apps, like you need to know what versions of all the software they're running. Are they facing the public internet? Do they store customer data? That's what PII, personally identifiable information, means here. And the reason the web-facing part is so important is if something faces the public internet, it's just going to get attacked. Like you can't stop that. You have to, be shipping code that's secure if it's on the public internet. That's just the kind of harsh reality of it. So asset management is like by far the best place to start in terms of cybersecurity. The second point is developer education. So most businesses using Elixir, I think, are not in the situation where, this app was written 10 years ago and nobody's touched it since. There are businesses with that problem. I think everyone here is probably working on an app where people are pushing code, daily into production. So making sure that your developers are aware of common web security issues is really important. And I want to kind of talk about there's two parts to this. The first is like general web security knowledge. So like what does XSS, CSRF, RCE, the OWASP top 10, like what is that stuff? That is sort of like the well-defined general web application security knowledge. So every person that does web development should really know what cross-site scripting is, if it's in whatever language. When you're working with Elixir and Phoenix, though, you should also understand what are the risks that are specific to the code you're working in. So like, how does remote code execution, happen with binary to term? Or like, what is action reuse CSRF? Those are the Elixir specific things. So if you're, just want to learn more on your own, you want to train your own developers, this book is old, 2011, the Web Application Hackers Handbook, 2nd edition. It is still by far the best book on web application security. I haven't found one that's better. The author of it is also the founder of Portswigger, which makes Burp Suite. So there's not going to be a 3rd edition of this book, which I'm personally disappointed in because I love this topic. But they have the Web Security Academy, which is just like the labs. So, rather than reading the book to kind of stay up to date, you just kind of do the labs. These are completely free. I recommend them. Great company, great book though. But that's the thing is, those labs are not going to have anything specific to Elixir. It's more like the black box test where you're sending HTTP requests. So I am one of the authors of Potion Shop, which is an intentionally vulnerable Elixir and Phoenix application. So you can go out and read like what's cross-site scripting, what's SQL injection, and then you can actually go and play around with Potion Shop and figure out how to exploit that in a real app. I also publish a lot on the Praxial blog about like, what's remote code execution? How do you do it in Elixir? So if you just type, cross-site request forgery in Elixir Phoenix, Praxial is going to pop up and you can read those articles when it comes to developer education. Cool. Oh, I guess I should also plug the fact that Praxial, I don't even have a slide for it, but Praxial does trainings, usually at conferences. Like I did one for ElixirConf EU. You can hire me to like train your developers in Elixir security as well. I don't have a slide advertising it, but that is something that people have purchased, and there's some reviews on the website saying that I did a good job from past customers. Okay. Next up is the Elixir code security tools. So even if you don't purchase Praxial, although there's a free tier now, so I would recommend Praxial, these are kind of the 4 big open source ones. Soblo is a stack analysis tool. So that just means like source code in, it looks at the source code, and then we think there's like SQL injection or cross-site scripting here. Mix audit is to check for known vulnerable dependencies. So you're running some old outdated dependency that's known to be vulnerable to the Equifax bug. Mix audit will check that for you. Mix hex audit is actually built into Mix. So that's for retired dependencies that are no longer updated. The reason you don't want those is because if there is a security problem with them, you can't update. And you really don't want to be dealing with that like on the day of an incident. You want to make sure that you could just apply an update, which is usually the best way to just make yourself safe. And then Exploit Guard, I actually developed this to be part of Praxial. It can detect remote code executions at runtime. So this is compile time, these 3, meaning you can do them like in your GitHub pull request CI/CD. Runtime is, as the application is running, somebody sends the exploit in, Exploit Guard can detect and block it and kill the Erlang process. It's also open source, so you can read it. You don't have to take my word for how it works. Minor PSA, if you're using Dependabot, you might think, oh, like Dependabot is telling me to bump all my Elixir dependencies, so like I'm good, like I don't have to use Mix Audit. My kind of word of caution here is that this library, Paginator, is like vulnerable to the Equifax problem. Like if you're running this in production right now, you need to get off this call and like go upgrade. That is really, really bad. Dependabot won't detect that because Elixir is not supported in the dependency graph product of GitHub. And this was actually part of my motivation for starting Praxial was there were all these like cybersecurity companies and they're like, oh, we support Elixir, but then like it's kind of supported, but then like some sub feature doesn't support it, and that's how you end up in this situation. So the open source tool will detect it. This is what it looks like, severity critical remote code execution. Watch out for that. For Soblo, I also wrote a guide to like how to use Soblo effectively. It's called Real World Soblo up on the Praxial blog. So if you're working and your boss is like, okay, we want you to get all the Soblo findings and fix them. Running Soblo is maybe 10% of that project, and then 90% is like triaging them and figuring out which ones are true and false positives and what you're going to do. So Praxial now actually has a free tier, which includes this if it's not commercial use. So if you just want to like play around with this in Potion Shop, you can do that right now. But it basically explains like what's the severity of this. This is the Soblo finding. So you've got confidence, file, line, type, and variable. But it doesn't have severity. So Praxial will tell you like this is critical. Like you absolutely need to pay attention to this. This is the highest one. How do you verify if it's true positive? Just check if user input is being passed in here. And then the fix is to just use non-executable binary term instead. It's literally a one-line fix. Praxial will actually put this in your pull request if you're using the GitHub app because it's so simple. It's literally a one-line change. So I have this as a feature. So also kind of like a PSA, just be careful if you're doing binary to term, just use JSON if you can. But yeah, Praxial runs, so Praxial, like the GitHub app, will run Soblo, Mix Audit, and Hex Audit. And this is really just what you want to see on all your PRs. Like it was scanned, no issues were found. Cool. So the next point I'm going to talk about is penetration testing. So this is where you hire an outside firm to basically come and check your work, saying like, what is our kind of security risk? People do this for different reasons. Sometimes it's to check a box. Sometimes it's because you have a sale where you need a pen test. Sometimes you have like kind of a feeling that, there might actually be a security problem and you want them to find it. I never really understood the box checking thing because if you're going to spend the time and money to hire a pen tester, I think it's honestly cheaper just to hire a good one than to like get the box checking done because you now have this massive risk of like your business being breached. So that never really made any sense to me, but that happens. So in the context we're talking here, it's also known as a web application security assessment, meaning sometimes you do like a pen test to somebody like social engineering, like your employees or like, just scanning your whole internal network. That's not really what we're talking about here. This is like we have an Elixir app or a few Elixir apps. They're facing the public internet. We want to find the security problems in them. So that's why like also with the lower end vendors, you're just going to run a scanner and give you an output, and that's useless. Like you could do that yourself and that's free. A good pen test understands your business context and will prioritize the findings that are specific to what you care about. So, communicate with who you're assessing during the engagement. Say like, this is what we're looking for. This is what we care about. A good pen test provider will listen to you and help you there. So the other thing is your Elixir project probably has custom functionality. So like the underlying web server, it's like EC2 or GigElixir or FlyIO. Is your database exposed to the public internet? Are you processing image uploads with like ImageMagick or FFmpeg? That's a big security risk. The person who is testing should have experience with this stuff. Ideally, they have Elixir experience. I know in practice that doesn't always happen. But as long as they have experience like with web applications and with kind of what you're doing, that's a good thing. Ideally, Elixir experience, but Praxial is kind of a niche player in the market in that way. Okay, cool. So we've covered asset management, developer education, code security tools, and pen testing. And by the way, most businesses don't have all this locked down. But if you do, like that's really good. But there is still another big risk that you need to be aware of, which is denial of service and bot attacks. So a DDoS attack is pretty straightforward. If you cannot use your application right now and your logs are going crazy with like a million requests a second, it's kind of obvious. There is another type of attack that I'm gonna like differentiate them here. This bot attack is usually like HTTP requests where somebody is trying to break into user accounts. Like they're sending requests to your login endpoint. It's not just like dumb, like layer 3 or layer 4 traffic. This is like layer 7 HTTP. They're trying to take over user accounts. Some tools you might see, rate limiting is really good. I'll talk about that. CAPTCHA, everyone hates, so maybe you don't want to do that. And then there's also vendors for this. So 23andMe is a genetics company. They had a pretty big problem with this. It wasn't like Equifax where the web server was hacked. This was just somebody wrote a bot to do this kind of attack. And it caused a really, really big problem for them. And you'd think 23andMe would have good security considering like the data that they're processing. They definitely had like a security budget. But this is just kind of like a really nasty attack that you have to be aware of. So this also relates to logging and monitoring. Like usually you're going to have logs for your application. And it's usually not even for security reasons, it's usually for like debugging and stuff. Ideally, you want to log like account creation, if a user does a credit card transaction, get metrics. Like let's say you have 100 login attempts per hour, and then, or you have 100, like maybe 10 signups a day, and then suddenly you get 500,000 signups a day. You're probably not going viral. You're probably the victim of like a credit card fraud attack, and you're gonna have to ban all those people. So rate limiting and then logging and monitoring go together really, really well. So this is an example from Paraxial, where you set up a rule on like the user's login endpoint that's like 5 requests in 10 seconds, ban that attack. Rate limiting on IP seems really basic, right? Like you think everyone has this, they don't. And when an attack happens, like let's say you get a captcha or something, and then somebody bypasses the captcha, and they're like, and then the next day, everyone's sitting in the conference room and they're like, this guy did 1 million requests from one IP. Like, why didn't we catch that and ban? Why can one IP do 100,000 requests an hour? Like that's insane. So it's really easy to like advocate for rate limiting the day after, the way it's easy to advocate for like buying a fire extinguisher, after the fire. So I think rate limiting is great. You can actually do it on the free tier of Paraxial if you don't send those requests to the backend. So use the Paraxial free tier if you're using Elixir. There's really no reason not to. I guess the commercial use, you could also use a open source library, but you just wouldn't get like the alerts and stuff. So the way that the bad guys bypass rate limiting is they proxy all of their traffic through cloud providers. So it's really cheap to just proxy all your HTTP requests through AWS here. So now every request has a different IP address. And this was actually how I saw that attack earlier I was talking about, where the people's like bank accounts were getting hacked. I saw this work. This bypassed the protection, and it was really, really bad. So this is a Praxial feature. Oh, it's also available in free tier too. So the way this works is it gets this Rodux trie. It's just like a data structure from the Praxial backend. And the reason for that is just really efficient. So a request, like a con, is going through the pipeline. It matches the incoming IP against that data structure. If the incoming request comes from an AWS server and it's to your login page, you want to block that, just period. And it's nice because you get the plug, and you might have an API endpoint where you expect bot traffic. So you're not going to block it there. But login attempts from a rented cloud server, that's a huge red flag. You definitely want to ban that. So that's a feature that's also in the free tier. You can just download it and start using it. It doesn't charge your account. Cool. And then this is the last feature of Praxial. This has actually been going crazy the past few days. I've gotten like, I think it was like 20 or 30 yesterday. The way this works is you take an HTML form and you put it on your site, and then the malicious bots find the form and submit it. And this is just constant on the internet. The thing is, only a malicious bot would ever submit that form. Like a true user never would. So this is like, that's where the term honeypot comes from, where it's a trap that only somebody doing something bad would fall into, and you get banned. And then you also get a Slack alert, and it's kind of fun to watch all the Slack alerts come in. So that's how Praxial does bot defense. This is free tier too. Yeah, it is. That's cool. So this is also on the free tier. What's cool is Praxial, like the way I'd recommend just doing all of this is how Praxial does it, is have this on your back end, like in the Elixir code. Cloudflare is a really popular way people do this. You can put Cloudflare in front of your server, and it'll actually work together because there's no conflict between like the Cloudflare server in front of it and then the control code on the back end. But the thing with the Cloudflare server is that's like a whole new piece of infrastructure. And if you leak your server's true IP, bots can actually just go around the Cloudflare server. And there's also like a whole industry, like go on GitHub and search like Cloudflare bypass. It's so popular, everyone like researches how to bypass it. The reason I like the kind of backend code for the bot defense is that like you can't bypass rate limiting, or you can't bypass the AWS example just because of like how TCP/IP works. So they're really good defenses that you definitely want to have in place. Okay, this brings me to the final one. So remember, these are ranked in order of priority. I put bug bounty last because I've personally worked on bug bounties before. Um, the way it works is, well, the ideal situation is an ethical hacker finds like a really bad Equifax tier security problem in your site, writes you about it. You say, thank you, here's some money. We appreciate your work. And then, that's so much cheaper compared to actually getting hacked. Um, in reality, what happens when you start a bug bounty is now all of the time that you've budgeted towards security is spent dealing with people that are just reporting kind of useless bugs that don't affect you at all, but they're trying to get, 50 or $100 out of you. And it's just it can be a huge pain. So what I'd recommend is like, don't do the bug bounty unless you have all 6 of those other things locked down, which again, most businesses don't. But if you do, if you're like super solid and like we just want to do a bug bounty, start by just accepting reports without any financial reward. It's kind of bad form to sue someone now if they report a vulnerability in good faith. Um, I personally wouldn't jump to like paying people until your business is big enough and ready. I think most companies using Elixir, if they're like a fast growing startup, bug bounty is just not really a good use of the time you have. So to summarize, oh, this is a map of Lisbon where I gave a version of this talk. So asset management updates, like number one, by far the most important thing. Developer education as well. And then the Elixir code security tools, Praxial is part of that. The penetration testing, just make sure you're working with, a vendor that knows Elixir, understands what you're doing. DDoS and bot attacks, you're going to need protection against that. It's just kind of inevitable. And that goes hand in hand with the logging and monitoring, and then the external vulnerability reports and bug bounties I have last here. Cool. So that concludes the talk. Thank you everyone for listening. I'm going to stop the recording now.